So, welcome to our session, Leveraging Discipline and Restorative Justice Data to Improve School Culture and Climate. Thanks, Kim. I see your chat. Welcome. We are going to kick off with a short welcome where I will briefly run through who I am and our objectives for the day, and then we'll run through some best practices, example tools and resources, a quick case study, and then some closing and action planning. Depending on how many of you are actually listening in, we may slow down for some of the activities for you to do some self reflection or speed up so you can go back and do them on your own. Hi, Kate. Hi, Tony. Hi, I don't know if I'm saying your name right, Catalin. It's so nice to meet you. The workbook should be adjusted. Try refreshing. If you still can't access it, let me know and I can go ahead and make that adjustment. Let me double check on my screen. It should be accessible now. Let me know if you can't. I will retry putting the link in right now. Just let me know in the chat if the workbook doesn't work. We don't need it right away. So that is all good. I can adjust if it still doesn't work. Okay, so who am I? As you've gathered, my name is Alana Zaffron Walden. I am based in Chicago, Illinois, originally from Boston, Massachusetts, which is actually where I am today. Okay, cool. Sorry, watching these chats. Let me see if check out that new link I put in and let me know if that new link works for the workbook. I'm gonna head back to the introductions while you all are hopefully accessing the workbook. I see you in there now, so wonderful. So as I said, my name's Alana. I'm from Boston, Massachusetts, where I am today. Normally work in Chicago. I own a small consulting firm, Forrest Zaffron Consulting LLC, and my work over the past 19 years has really focused on student engagement, particularly with high school students. I've worked with a number of schools across the country, and then also Chicago Public Schools as a full-time employee on district-wide initiatives. In addition to my work around student engagement, I also am a restorative justice practitioner. So I've had the pleasure of working on the ground in many schools, both with students and doing professional development. I'm a bit obsessed with infrastructure, systems, data, and all of those pieces, in addition to the actual practices of working with students in schools to address student discipline. I always feel it's important when I'm presenting to school audiences to mention that I'm also the mom of a soon to be first grader and fourth grader. My soon to be fourth grader is neurodiverse. And I mention this because parenting has taught me much about our education system, restorative practices, and student behavior that I didn't know before I became a parent. In terms of our session for today, we already reviewed the agenda. Our objectives are we want you all as participants to be able to hear and hopefully learn a few best practices for restorative justice and discipline data collection and analysis, hopefully audit your current schools or district systems and structures. We'll practice very briefly using a protocol to analyze and look at discipline and restorative practices data and identify corresponding data-driven actions. And then finally, we'll build in some reflection time, as I mentioned, for you to identify strengths and areas of opportunity for your own schools and district. Before I dive into best practices, I'd love if people could just indicate in the chat your level of familiarity with restorative practices. So is it something you're very familiar with, not as familiar with, just kind of expert at? If you can put that in the chat, that will be very helpful. I see a somewhat familiar. Thanks, Jason. Very familiar, emerging, love it. So I should say loud and clearly, this is not a restorative justice or restorative practices introduction or training session. I threw some slides into the appendix of this deck on how I and my consulting practice define restorative justice and restorative practices in case it's helpful, and happy to kind of answer questions as we go. But you should know that I am not what I would call a purist as I approach restorative practices and restorative justice in schools. And so you may hear things today that you're like, oh, I didn't know you could, do this with restorative justice. That is because I often draw on what I call a restorative justice mindset or principles when doing this work, as opposed to implementing practices in their pure form. Okay, so that being said, we're going to go into our first section. I see you on the workbook. Hopefully, you can make a copy of it because we can see my Google Docs are not very on today, because you'll want to make your own copy to use in a few minutes as we go through this session. So, best practices for collecting and analyzing discipline and restorative justice data. Going to say something that is probably not a surprise to you, which is that when we look at best practices for collecting and analyzing restorative practices and discipline data, it's really not much different from many other types of data best practices you have been exposed to and are familiar with. So I do want to review each of these practices, and we're going to talk about how you can apply them specifically to discipline, restorative justice, student behavior data. The first one I'm going to start up here is around measuring. So you want to make sure you have tools in place to measure anything you're doing related to restorative justice, both outputs and outcomes. We'll talk shortly about what the difference is between those two things and what types of tools you can use to measure both outputs and outcomes. Second, you don't just want to measure, you also want to be able to document, ideally in a centralized place or student information system, the restorative practice interventions that are taking place, as well as discipline referrals that are taking place or being sent to your office in your school or district. Third, we have review. You want to look at the data on a regular basis. That's some of that analysis piece. The fourth piece is you want to approach data with curiosity and a growth mindset. You want to identify patterns with students, teachers, subgroups of students, times of day, all of that. I want to name that this session is really about utilizing restorative justice, discipline data to change school culture. It's not about using data to develop individualized student intervention plans. So there may be a need, often there is, to create tier 2 and tier 3 supports for students. And there's a whole kind of different set of best practices, which are not my area of expertise, around using data to build and monitor those interventions. The sixth piece, when we think about best practices, is acting, right? You want to use that data, look at the patterns you've identified, and figure out how you can use what you're seeing to drive changes in student behavior. So we're going to go through each practice in a bit more detail. And in your participant packet, you'll see starting on page 2, there is a short audit, as I'm calling it, that we're going to pause after each practice piece here to give you maybe a minute just to reflect on what your school or district is currently doing as it relates to that best practice. In your Google Doc, you can highlight, you can bold, whatever you want to do wherever your school or district falls. I want to name that I should not have access to this document. You should be the only one that has access to it. It's not meant to be an evaluation. It's not meant for judgment. It's meant as an opportunity for you to reflect on where your school and district is, where strengths are, and where there's opportunities of growth. So we're going to start with best practice 1, which is around measuring output and outcome data. I want to name that there is on page 6 of your packet a more complete chart here, which talks through what outputs and outcomes are, what they measure, example measurements, and potential data sources for these pieces. In my experience working with schools and districts, I found that often schools and districts are tracking maybe 1 or 2 pieces from this far left column. Maybe they're tracking an output and a long-term outcome, but they're not looking at immediate outcomes or short-term outcomes. And so when we're thinking about best practices with discipline and restorative justice data, it's really important that we're looking at all 4 of these elements. Outputs, which are going to measure implementation, right? What are you actually doing? Are you conducting circles? Are you doing mediations? Are students getting suspended? What's actually happening? Immediate outcomes are going to look at experience and knowledge. These are skills, knowledge, values, attitudes that a person experiences immediately after engaging in the discipline and intervention, restorative practice. Maybe it's a professional development with staff. not a training on logic models, but from a logic model perspective, we want to be able to look at those immediate outcomes because those immediate outcomes will tell us if we're on track to achieve our short term and our long term outcomes. We define short term outcomes, at least for the sake of this presentation, is individual behavior from either students or staff. And so that's where you're going to be looking at, have we seen a decrease maybe in the number of suspensions from first to second semester? If we were looking at attendance data, have we seen a change in the number of students who are arriving at school on time? I guess that would be tardy data. And then long-term outcomes are those big school-wide culture metrics that we're going to be looking at, such as sense of belonging, have students have attendance rates increase, decrease in suspensions. It's important to say when we're thinking about discipline and restorative practices data, we don't only want to look at long-term outcomes related to have we decreased exclusionary discipline. Part of the theory of change around restorative practices is that they can help school environments be more inclusive. So you'll also want to be looking at metrics for long-term outcomes that measure things related to a sense of belonging, students feeling safe in the school environment, staff feeling safe. So you may need to pull in data from multiple sources when you're looking at these long-term outcomes, as well as some of these immediate outcomes and outputs. I'm going to pause my talking for a second and do two things. One is you're welcome, if you haven't already, to look at this first section of your workbook where we have an audit on, let me pull it up really quick so you can see it, where we have this measure audit, and you can just go right in and highlight or edit or whatever you want to do, gold, annotate if it's printed, where your school's at. Alternatively, or in addition, if you want to go ahead and shop in the chat any questions or comments as you're reflecting on this measurement piece, please feel free to do so. So I'm going to go ahead and just give you a quick minute here. Okay, so I'm going to keep us going onto our second best practice, which is documenting those outputs and outcomes. So the big takeaway on this is you want to make sure that you are documenting the restorative practices you're doing in any discipline referrals in a district-wide or school-wide student information system. So a lot of the districts I work with will use Skyward, Power School, Aspen. I know a district today is talking about Tableau. And you want to go ahead and work with that vendor to customize the platform so that you can single select restorative practices, the specific types of restorative practices you're doing as a response to discipline referrals. So it's really important that you are able to specify, are we doing circles? Are we doing mediations? And that is a drop down, because there are many districts I've worked with where they're just entering in the narrative, oh, students got referred for loud altercation in the hallway, then we did restorative practices. The challenge with that is that when we try to look at that data in an aggregate format, it's really not easy to pull in a dashboard that we can use to monitor what's happening overall. So we want to make sure that that is happening. In a worst case scenario, you could use a Google Sheet to track restorative practices, although it is definitely not recommended. I want to just name that there are some pitfalls that happen when we think about documenting so that you can avoid them, especially if you're at the beginning of this journey. So the first is not recording all discipline referrals in that student information system. Sometimes I'll see schools where they're still using paper referrals, and they, either because of capacity or lack of will, take all those referrals and shove them in a drawer and no one knows they exist. This creates challenges because then when we're looking at the data in the student information system, we don't have a full picture of what's going on with the school. The second challenge is an underreporting of restorative responses. Typically, this happens because schools are doing restorative justice as an alternative to traditional discipline. And because of that, they don't want to enter that incident with the restorative response into their school's incident report, student information system. It's really going to be up to your district and school how you handle that. I have seen districts use something like Panorama or like a branching minds, like an MTSS intervention tool to track those more proactive restorative practices, and that's okay. It's very important though that you have business rules around which restorative practices are getting entered where. And then finally, when you're looking at those referrals, just be aware that if your code of conduct is changing or policies changing, that's going to impact how things are entered and how your data looks. And then the final piece here is when a lot of your referrals have general insubordination or disruptive behavior, and there's not a clear picture of why students are being referred, it can make the discipline data less useful. If you have been following along, you can definitely take a minute here, probably not a minute, more like 30 seconds. Check out this review section in the audit and feel free to think about, assess where your school may be hitting the mark and where there may be opportunities for improvement. Give people a second. You can continue filling out as we go. Our third best practice, this is definitely a universal best practice for data analysis. You want to review data regularly with diverse stakeholders. So you should have a team in place who's charged with reviewing your discipline and restorative justice data. I've seen these called culture and climate teams, restorative justice and discipline team, supportive discipline action team. The list goes on and on. Cult- I am not partial to any particular team name, but we do want it to be clear what team is responsible for this data review. The team should include people who are going to bring multiple perspectives to the table. So, people who have on the ground knowledge about what's going on in the building so they can bring in some of that qualitative perspective that we can't see in the data. Um, and then people who may have an understanding of student experiences because they identify with students or the community that the school sits in. Finally, you want consistency. So you want to make sure that that team is meeting at a regular cadence to review the components of restorative justice and discipline data. It doesn't mean that they're reviewing the same data each time. On that chart on page 6, there's some recommended cadences for how frequently the data is reviewed. And so you just want to schedule that out, ideally calendar out when the team is meeting and what types of data they'll be reviewing at each meeting. All right, I'm gonna fly through these last few practices, and then we'll give you a chance to wrap up or kind of start, I should say, on pieces of the audit you haven't gotten to. This fourth best practice is approaching data with curiosity, another universal best practice. Really important when you're looking at restorative justice and discipline data to not go in with an attitude of judgment, of blame, of assumptions, and to approach the data with a growth mindset, really trying to understand what may be driving the data. This often means that you may have to look at the data, analyze, discuss, go gather more information, and then come back to get to that final step of planning action. Our fifth best practice is around identifying patterns. So when we're looking at restorative justice and discipline data and trying to leverage it to change school culture and climate, we're going to look both at student characteristics as well as incident characteristics. Because we know that school discipline disproportionately negatively impacts students of color and students with IEPs and 504s, I always look at school discipline data and restorative justice intervention data by race and IEP 504 status, looking at other special populations like English language learners, students in temporary living situations is really important for looking for patterns. And you'll want to kind of look at multiple layers. So I've certainly worked in schools where they've been able to identify, hey, it's our ninth grade African American girls who are accounting for a disproportionate number of discipline referrals. That lets us then as adults think about what different interventions do we need to be providing to this subset of students. And we'll talk more about how you decide what you do, but it lets us focus in on a specific group of students using almost a targeted universalism approach. The second piece, and this is a piece where schools don't always look, is around incident characteristics. So we don't just want to look at the students, we also want to look at the types of infraction, the time of day, the time of year, where the infractions are taking place, the response, the teacher staff referring. At my kids' school, for example, it's clear that they have the most number of incidents at recess. And so this is a really important piece of information so that the principal and school staff can think about what may we need to do in terms of how we structure recess or how we train the staff who are monitoring recess so that they can intervene in different ways. Finally, we have our sixth piece here, which is act to drive change. So once you've identified those patterns, the question then becomes, what can we as adults do to create the structures, systems, policy that is going to best support our students? So there's usually four buckets, if you will, of ways that you can act to drive change in response to discipline and restorative justice data. The first one is teaching skills. So in the example I used a few minutes ago, that group of freshmen girls was having a lot of conflict with one another. And so one of the pieces we put into place was actually a weekly girls group where the girls were learning conflict resolution skills, but also focusing on intentionally building relationships with each other. So we're pulling in that restorative element of community building, but also because of the data, knew that that group of girls probably needed another layer of support and teaching related to communication and conflict resolution. Second bucket is behavior supports. Third bucket is staff training. This is a really big one, especially when you see that there are certain staff members or periods of the day where we're seeing a higher number of discipline referrals or challenges with student behavior. And then the fourth bucket is policy. So we were looking at tardy data with a district I worked with this year. And one of the things that became very clear was that the way the school's policies were set up, there was no incentive for students to be at school on time. And the discipline consequences they were giving to students were not deterring the tardiness, right? So it was not an effective consequence. So again, in that case, we use the data to say, hey, we probably need to think differently about what are our policies related to tardy? What are the actual consequences that happen for a student and their family when they're tardy so that we can think differently about what could drive change related to student tardiness? Okay, I'm going to move on in a second to some example tools and resources. Before I do that, I would love, if you haven't already, for you to look through that audit that is in that packet and identify one or two areas in the chat, or you can come off mute if you're able to and want to, where you feel like your school is really excelling or your district is really excelling, and then an area or two where you feel as if your school or district could strive for some improvement. Feel free to just take a minute. I got 54 here in terms of 6 minutes before the hour, and throw in the chat kind of where your head's at. Thanks, Tessa. Are there any specific areas where you think that your school will be like starting when you think about the data? Any section in the audit, Kim, or any reactions you have if you haven't had a chance to look through the audit. Thanks, Amelia. So, Amelia said that they're pretty good at detecting patterns and reforming policy, but it's based on observational data and not hard data. So, getting that hard data can be a challenge. Any others? Places where people are not willing to make changes in some cases. Yeah, so maybe the data, I'm intuiting from what you're saying, Jason, that the data may be um, very clear about the types of changes that need to happen, but people may not be willing to engage in those changes. Others, when you think about the practices for collecting and analyzing restorative justice and discipline data, anything that's working or not. Thanks, Kim. The big difference between restorative practices and restorative justice is, and this is actually, I put this in the appendix on the deck. It is odds. Let me pull it up really quick. Um, on slide 22. I sometimes use them interchangeably, but restorative justice is a mindset, philosophy, a set of values, and restorative practices are tools and strategies. So you can almost think of it like yoga, whereas you can do yoga just like you can do a peace circle, but yoga in of itself was envisioned as a kind of a philosophy and way of life. And so we can make choices in every interaction or conversation we have to operate from a place of restorative justice, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're doing restorative practices. And the opposite can be true. You can be saying you're doing restorative practices, but not doing them with fidelity, and therefore not really doing restorative justice. So hopefully that's like a whole day training in of itself, but hopefully that's helpful in terms of clearing that up. So yeah, I think just to respond to a few of the chats and also keep us going, I think that one of the things I have found in my experience is that when we tend to have trouble with buy-in of people, which is a common challenge with restorative practices and restorative justice, being able to really look at some of those immediate outcomes can be super helpful. So, in all schools and districts I've worked with, we use exit slips to measure the experience people have during professional development. If we're doing PD on restorative practices and restorative justice, and also at beginning of year, middle of year, end of year. We sometimes do this with students too. And then we'll also give exit slips after implementing a restorative practice. These are linked. I will fix if there are any access issues. Whoa, sorry about that. Momentarily, but they're linked on page 9 at the top at the top of that page. There's an example in school suspension exit slip, RP exit slip, and staff survey. And I have found that using these tools and sharing these results publicly can often help garner some of that initial buy-in for staff, but it's important that the restorative practices are done with fidelity because often that's where we lose buy-in because people feel there's no accountability, which is a separate issue. But I think data can play a really important role, both those long and medium term or long and short term outcomes, but also those immediate outcomes in terms of helping a school staff realize the potential impact of restorative practices. Okay, so those are just some example measurement tools. Happy to answer questions about those if there are those. I wanted to give people, wow, my screen is having a problem there. I wanted to give people a few minutes actually, to engage in a quick little mock exercise here using a discipline data review protocol. So I am sharing with you, and this is obviously something you would want to make your own, but an example protocol. I'm going to drop it in the chat that I have used with many schools and districts to help them analyze and look at their restorative practices and discipline data. We've already talked about a lot of the key things you want to look at when you're watching this, but this is actually a tool that I adapted from an administrator I worked with years ago who would have our culture and climate team use this protocol on an annual basis. So there is an example, and I put together kind of like a mock data set, very like pared down because I knew we were going to be in a crunch for time here. So I am going to go ahead and share with you in the chat a mock data set. And you'll see when you open this document, I just put it in the chat, that there are 3 tabs. The first tab has some made up school race demographics. The second tab looks at events, which are basically incidents and the number of students in each grade level. So you can see, let me move this over here. So you can see right here, this is a high school, and what we're looking at, you'll see, for example, this is 9 students with academic dishonesty, which is 17% of the total referrals for the year for academic dishonesty. And then you can also see here kind of the total number of referrals by grade level. Table B is similar data, but similar layout, different data. This is looking at the outcomes, so what the resolution was to those discipline referrals, and we're looking at it by race here. So same idea, you can see afternoon detention, 122 Hispanic Latino students, which is 14% of all students, or of all the referrals for afternoon detention for the year. And again, I put those school-wide demographics on the front so you could look at disproportionality. I see you in the data set, so I think everyone can access it. In your packet on page 7 is a very pared down version of the data protocol. And what I'm going to ask you to do, if you are able, is to take, let's maybe start with 5 minutes and choose either table A or table B. And go ahead and start looking at the data and answering those questions. Unless people want to do it as a group. And if you want to do it as a group instead of individually, go ahead and just name that. If you could put in the chat, group or individual, that would be awesome. We are going to go through the protocol here. Group. I got a group from Jason. Okay, 2 groups. That is fine as long as you either come off mute or put in the chat because I am getting tired of hearing myself talk. So let's start with group, and I'll keep the protocol up on my screen. But let's start by looking at the total number of referrals for each grade level. And please feel free to unmute. So let's go straight through. When you look at the data, what grade level is having the most challenges?
Give me this is Kim. Just give me a minute because I need to get 2 different screens going and I'm struggling. So
That's all good. I can put the data up on my screen too, if that helps. Although I don't know.
Is it 12th grade? Is that what you're looking at? The one with the highest percentage?
If you want to, yes, part of the challenge, it looks like 12, followed by freshmen, right? With a close second there. Yeah. And let's look at the next question is, what is your analysis of why that may be? I understand it's not your school, so you may not have answers to that, but I'm curious if from your experience you have thoughts on why 9th and 12th graders may have the highest number of referrals.
Well, because they're freshmen, basically 8th graders, and they're seniors who have senioritis.
Yeah, exactly. That would be my best guess too. They're ready to go, especially if we're looking at end of year data, right? And then if we look, and we can just shout out a few of them since I know we won't have time to do the full analysis. What are students in each grade level most commonly being referred for? So where do you see some of those percentages jump? And look at those raw numbers. Because I think this is a good example. Some of these, like you have one student here, some of these examples where it's a high percentage, but it's really only one student can be very off-putting.
So tardiness
Yeah.
would be the biggest thing. And then my question is this the primary incident, or is there an event that has multiple incidents related to it? So could be duplicated events or duplicated students.
So it's the primary events for the incident, but but students may be counted more than once, right? So those 209 ninth graders who have been tardy, or it's 209 incidences of students who have been tardy, and maybe it's only been 50 students. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, we have a lot of tardies. Definitely some issues with radio beeper phones. Other things where you're seeing high numbers. No ID card.
Well, with freshmen, I see a lot of obscenities and misconduct, but misconduct to me is very broad, and I'm not really sure that gives me a lot of information.
So what may be just like looking at this and with that broad misconduct, some of the other things you're seeing, what are next steps that you may put in place to respond to this data? And a next step may be working to gather more information, right? So what are some of those next steps?
If I'm in a big school that has like a freshman academy or teachers that only teach freshmen, we're probably sitting down for some kind of powwow to talk about what they're seeing and exactly what that means. Because are all of those things making it to the office, or are these just classroom referrals? Or are they also office referrals? Are they combined?
They're combined.
Okay.
Yeah, I was thinking similar lines. I think Amelia, you were the one just speaking of I think I would probably want to disaggregate those misconducts for sure, and the misbehavior, disrespect, kind of those general ones by teacher, because it makes me wonder if there's a particular teacher who's maybe having some challenges establishing community in their classroom or with referrals. But I'd be curious to know if there were teacher or class patterns to those misconducts particularly. Are there other actions, not just related to misconduct, but looking at this data that you would think about taking?
I think if you look at the teacher data, you may want to work with that individual teacher if it's because there are too many referrals, what changes can be made in the classroom. The other thing that we're talking about here at our school is we have a lot of discipline referrals that are considered other, which is similar to the misconduct. And so we're trying to set some protocols up into how that those things could be defined with other types of incidents to be more specific. So the other situation might even go to the wayside, and we might break that down even further.
Yeah, and I think with the idea of restorative practices, part of it is to really be able to address the root cause and the root behavior, or the root cause of the behavior. And the more information we have about what that other or what that misconduct is, the easier it is to then address what may be the root cause of the behavior, right? If we're just looking at other, it really gives us nothing to work with. We shouldn't say nothing, but very little. I would say like a similar thing around tardiness. I think tardiness is a really strong example of where the quantitative data isn't going to tell us the whole story. And so we've worked with schools and districts when we see these high numbers to really do student level focus groups, engage parents, and really collect some other types of data that are going to give us some background knowledge on what may be driving that tardiness to class. Any other things when you look at this data where you think about actions you may take based on what you're seeing? Okay. I will say one more thing to make the connection explicit, since I know we have some novices on restorative practices in here. While we are looking at discipline data, the direct kind of bright line to restorative practices are if we know students are coming to class tardy, for example, because they don't see the importance of going to class on time, it allows us to then not just put those students in detention, which is often a response schools use, but rather instead to think about what activities, interventions, talking circles, experiences could we provide these students that would help them really understand the impact of coming tardy to school and the impact that that tardiness has on themselves, their school community, and their future. And so that ultimately, at the end of the day, implementing restorative practices, especially in order to address student behavior and school climate, and improve school climate, can only be done most effectively when we're able to really analyze the discipline data, because that lets us know the areas that are potentially broken or not as strong as they could be, where we need to implement some of those restorative practices. Okay, let's take a quick look at table B. Similar kind of questions here around what are some of those first things that you're seeing or noticing in the data. We're going to skip over that number of students receiving, but maybe look at some of the trends and disproportionalities you may see related to race, gender, IEP 504. Feel free to put them in the chat or shout them out. Right. Jared, I think I am saying your name correctly. Disproportionate Black students in the suspension category. Particularly when right here, we can see this, especially because we know that the school only has 2% Black students. Any other things jumping out for people?
Seems like there's also a high number of teacher contact to white families, or to white families as compared to
None to Black students.
yeah.
Yeah. And this is also an example, in case you're kind of puzzling over the resolutions, of like I scrubbed this based on a few different districts I've worked with. And so it's a good example of some of the ways that restorative practices can be entered into the school's discipline system. So you can see teacher contact, assuming that that's a phone call home or an opportunity to talk to parents about the issue, could be seen as a restorative response. Restorative conversation, also pretty high for white students right there. Right? That's another restorative response, peer mediation. And so as you're looking at some of these responses, obviously grouping and aggregating them by restorative versus more exclusionary is definitely something you can do. So as a school and as a district, if you're looking at data like this, it's really important to explore those racial disproportionalities, which I helped stack the data so that some of those would show up, since that is often something that shows up. This data set can also kind of give you an opportunity to think through, are there what does your menu of resolutions look like in your school's information system right now, or district's information system, and how may you need to edit or change it so it better reflects some of the restorative practices you're doing. Okay, I'm not going to make you go through all the responses. Hopefully this gives you a sense of how you could look at the trends. I will ask, before we wrap up this little exercise, are there next steps, actions, what may you put in place to respond to some of the things we just pointed out around some of those disproportionalities in discipline and restorative justice?
So I'd just like to say I would like to see information on what resolution was issued for which
Incident.
events. Like, I
Yep.
think that's important information that's missing. Like, are we giving some kids detention for something that other kids are getting a phone call home on the first offense? Like, I don't know. Like, I feel like that's missing from our data.
Yeah, definitely. And that obviously, hopefully, is something that you definitely want to see when you're looking at the data and looking at the analysis. other questions or next steps. So one would be additional analysis, looking at that crosswalk of outcome, race, and the incident type. Other next steps. I think I would just say, I think another big thing I'd want to look at is this is where that duplicated versus unduplicated would come into play too. I think understanding for some of these disproportionate numbers, is it unique students or is it a small subset of students, could help us also understand what may be going on here. And if it's a case of a small subset of students needing more intensive interventions versus kind of more system policy wide challenges. Any other thoughts on next steps you would take here? Okay, I know we have about 3 minutes left. So as we move towards wrapping up this speed 50 minutes, I want to offer that I hope that you keep in touch because, as I said, this was really a speed session. I'm happy to answer questions that you may have in these last few minutes, either about restorative practices or what you may be taking with you. I'm going to turn off my screen share, but I'm certainly hopeful that despite all the information that we crammed in a very short period of time, there are pieces that you're able to take back with you, whether that's a consideration for something you may do differently, an idea that you want to learn more about, whatever it may be.